It's happening. May God have mercy on our souls. The haunting words crackled through the shortwave radio, followed by a burst of static, then silence. Doctor. Lena Novak felt an icy chill run down her spine as she stood frozen, staring at the device on her lab bench. Around her, the underground research bunker hummed with the white noise of fans and equipment. It was a sound she normally found soothing, but in this moment it felt ominous, almost mocking. She had known this day might come. The entire world had been holding its breath for months, watching with growing dread as tensions between the global superpowers escalated to a fever pitch. Threats and ultimatums were exchanged like trading cards. Negotiations crumbled. Missiles were primed. It seemed almost inevitable that the conflict would reach a breaking point. But she had hoped, perhaps naively, that cooler heads would prevail, that the leaders would step back from the brink when faced with the horrific reality of nuclear war. Surely, she had thought, they would not be so reckless, so cavalier, as to plunge the planet into atomic Armageddon. She had been wrong. They all had. Lena gripped the edge of the bench, her knuckles white, as a wave of nausea and panic threatened to overtake her. This was really happening. After decades of tenuous peace, of the world exhaling the breath it had been holding since the Cuban Missile Crisis, the nukes were finally flying. She knew the broad strokes of what would follow. The unimaginable destruction as cities were vaporized in blinding flashes of light. The towering mushroom clouds riddling the skylines like a hellish garden. The ferocious shock waves leveling buildings for miles. The searing heat setting the very air ablaze. And then would come the fallout. The toxic black rain, laden with radioactive ash and dust, poisoning everything it touched, blotting out the sun and plunging the world into a choking darkness, sentencing millions of survivors to a slow, agonizing death as the radiation ravaged their bodies cell by cell, or worse, a fast death as society crumbled and the desperate, lawless survivors turned on each other like feral animals. As famine and disease reaped their own merciless toll alongside the bombs, a strangled sob escaped Lena's throat at the thought, at the brutal, senseless waste of it all. What kind of world would be left? What life could possibly remain? She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to center herself, to draw on the reserve of inner strength that had gotten her through med school, through the grueling years of residency, through the piles of corpses she had autopsied searching for a cure to the engineered bioweapon that had decimated New York a decade ago. She would need every ounce of that strength now. She and the 57 other souls huddled in this underground shelter, her responsibility, her burden to bear as the chief medical officer. It had been a role she accepted with grim determination when the Palo Alto Nucleovirology Institute had first constructed this facility, a hedge against an unthinkable future, a bastion of hope and knowledge to ride out the storm and rebuild what came after, to salvage some shred of humanity from the wreckage. She had always known that future might come to pass, always quietly dreaded and planned for it, even as she prayed it never would. But now, as the wail of the shelter's radiation sirens echoed through the halls, cold reality sank in. This was no longer hypothetical, no longer some abstract apocalyptic scenario. This was real, raw, visceral, happening right now above their heads, the world as they knew it was ending. Lena took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to steel her nerves, to fortify the mental walls she would need to be the leader the survivors deserved. Her personal feelings, her sorrow and fear and despair, those would have to wait, would have to be walled off, compartmentalized, tucked away to process later. Right now she had to act, had to mobilize. There were 1,000 things that needed to be done. Supply inventories to be triple-checked, radiation exposure protocols to review with the team, backup power systems and hydroponics to inspect, survivors to tend to, as they trickled in from the institute above, if they trickled in at all. Lena shook her head, banishing the dark thought before it could take root. She refused to contemplate that possibility yet. To imagine she and the 57 already here might be all that remained, the last embers of humanity sheltered against the oncoming black. She straightened up, squaring her shoulders as she shifted into crisis mode. There would be time to grieve later, to process the staggering losses they all faced. But right now she had to lead, had to guide her people through the critical first hours and days. One foot in front of the other, Lena strode toward the door, shedding the numb haze of shock with each step, replacing it with purpose, resolve, the mantle of command. She had trained for this, prepared for this, and she would not fail. Could not. Too much depended on her. On all of them. They were perhaps the world's last best hope, she and the other scientists, doctors, engineers. The seed bank of human knowledge, saved to sow a new world from the ashes of the old. It was a terrible burden, and an awesome responsibility, but one they would all have to shoulder in the days ahead, in the hard years of reckoning to come. As Lena stepped out into the chaos of the hall, her jaw clenched in solemn determination. She silently vowed to do whatever it took, to pour every fiber of her being into ensuring the survival of her people. That was her duty, her sacred charge. It was all that mattered now, all that existed in this bombed-out shadow of a world, this shelter, this team, the precious cache of knowledge they guarded, that faint flicker of stubborn human spirit that even nuclear Armageddon could not snuff out. Lena's eyes hardened with steely resolve. That flicker would endure. She would make damn sure of it. The days blurred together into a hellish collage of crisis management and sleep deprivation. Lena hurtled from one medical emergency to the next, triaging the burned, the maimed, those wrecked with radiation poisoning, as they staggered into the facility. She and her team were pushed to their mental and physical limits, running on fumes and adrenaline, amputating limbs, excising necrotic tissue, frantically dosing anti-radiation meds and pushing fluids. The bunker's shielding held, mercifully limiting their exposure. But even a little radiation, compounded over days and weeks, took its toll. Lena watched her staff slowly deteriorate, battling nausea and fatigue as the insidious poison accumulated in their bodies. No one complained. No one balked from their duty. The work continued. The fights to save every possible life, to salvage each precious scrap of humanity from the charnel house their world had become. It was brutal, soul-crushing labor, and even their most heroic efforts claimed only a few. The vast majority of the injured succumbed, their bodies too ravaged to endure. Each loss hit Lena like a physical blow, leaving her hollowed out and heartsick. But she forced herself to keep going, to numb herself to the horror and forge ahead. What choice did she have? People were depending on her. The dead could be mourned later, in the dark when she collapsed into a troubled sleep. Right now, the living needed her, needed all of her strength and skill and determination. So she gave it to them, holding nothing back. This was the task she had to accept it, the measure of herself as a woman and a doctor. Days turned to weeks. The trickle of survivors dried up, tapering off to nothing. An eerie stillness settled over the facility as the adrenaline ebbed away. Into that aftermath, Lena threw herself into research, into analyzing blood samples and cellular scans, desperately searching for treatments, for ways to repair and reroute around the systemic damage. It was in that data that she first glimpsed the anomalies, the subtle shifts and mutations proliferating through their DNA, rapid changes accumulating at an unheard of rate. Lena frowned over the results, double and triple checking her findings. This shouldn't be possible. Irradiated cells didn't gain complex new functions like this. They degraded, broke down, but the evidence was undeniable. The fallout was acting as a ferocious mutagen, dramatically accelerating their evolution, reshaping their biology in radical and unpredictable ways. Some changes were small. Altered skin pigmentation, thicker body hair, improved night vision, but others were drastic. Rewired neural pathways, novel organs budding behind the spleen, fundamental mutations to core life processes. It defied everything Lena knew about genetics and evolution, about the incremental rate at which species changed. But here it was, live and in the pulsing flesh, rewriting their bodies cell by cell. Where it would lead was impossible to say. Whether it was humanity's salvation or damnation was anyone's guess, but one thing was clear: they needed more data, more observations, more survivors. Lena stared at the computer screen, her gut a solid knot of trepidation. She had run and rerun the simulations a dozen times, hoping the numbers would come out different, that she could find a flaw in the models, but they all pointed to the same grim conclusion. The shelter's hydroponics couldn't sustain their current population, not with the damage to the grow lights. Already they were on half rations. In another month they'd be starving. They needed to find more supplies, more salvage to repair the equipment. but that meant sending people topside, into the blasted hellscape that had once been California, with the invisible specter of radiation haunting every step. It wasn't just the rads, though. It was the other survivors. The desperate half-feral scavengers who would kill for a crust of bread, whose humanity had burned away, leaving only a brutal instinct to survive at any cost. Lena took a deep breath, rubbing a weary hand over her face. It was an awful risk, a potential suicide mission. But what choice did they have? Sit here and slowly waste away? Surrender to an ignoble end? No. They had to act. Had to gird themselves and brave the wasteland. For the supplies they needed. For the future of the shelter and the precious lives in her care. This was a defining moment. What came next would make or break them. She reached for the intercom, steeling herself. It was time to ask for volunteers, to call upon that ember of stubborn human spirit to light their way forward, into the terrible unknown, into whatever mutated world awaited them above. The relief party picked their way through the blasted rubble of Palo Alto, stepping gingerly past chunks of pulverized concrete studded with rebar fangs. The skeletons of collapsed office towers loomed above them, jagged metal bones thrusting up from the debris. Lena led the way, a scavenged rifle tight against her shoulder, finger poised on the trigger. Her eyes ceaselessly swept the gray hellscape ahead, probing every shadow for threats, for an ambush by desperate raiders, or some ghastly new mutated thing birthed in the fallout. The three volunteers behind her mirrored her tense vigilance, each carrying a makeshift weapon, a length of pipe, a rusted machete, a nail-studded club, plus bulky packs to carry any salvage. Lena had wanted to come alone, to spare her people this risk, but the shelter's council had been adamant. It was too dangerous to go solo. The supplies were too vital to entrust to one neck. So this small party had been assembled and sent forth, into the perilous unknown to secure their future. They all understood the stakes, the razor's edge between survival and oblivion on which they balanced. Lena held up a fist, halting the group. Something had moved ahead, a furtive shadow ducking behind a mound of crumbled brick. She raised her rifle, pulling it tight against her cheek. Her heart thudded as she sighted down the barrel, finger tightening on the trigger. Was it salvagers? Some ravenous mutant beast? She fought to steady her breathing, to quell the tremor in her hands. A long moment crawled past. The shadow remained still, unmoving. Was it her imagination? Some trick of the wind swirling the pervasive dust and ash? They couldn't afford to take chances. Gritting her teeth, Lena squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against her shoulder, and a thunderous report shattered the eerie silence. The bullet struck the debris pile in a puff of powdered masonry. And the shadow moved, writhed. Dozens of them. A rippling sea of gray. Lena jolted, eyes widening as the forms resolved into a pack of dogs. Feral, emaciated things, all jutting ribs and matted fur. Their bared teeth glinted as they growled, yellow eyes gleaming with desperate hunger. Lena swore, struggling to line up another shot as the dogs surged forward, a tide of snarling fur. She squeezed off a round, then another, the rifle bucking in her hands. Panic rose in her throat as she glimpsed the size of the pack, dozens strong, far too many to gun down. The volunteers behind her cursed, bringing their own weapons to bear. The pipe wielder swung at the first lunging mutt, connecting with its skull in a grisly crunch. Another dog sank its teeth into the machete wielder's shin, and he screamed, stabbing down frantically to dislodge it. The third volunteer kicked a leaping hound aside, then caved in its ribs with his club. Lena tried to block out the snarls and yelps, the panicked shouts of her people. She lined up her shots with cold precision, drilling the lead mutts through the eyes, determined to thin the pack, to give her people a chance against the tide of fur and fangs. But there were too many. They just kept coming, heedless of their fallen, driven by gnawing hunger and feral desperation. She could almost see the madness in their eyes, the unhinged wildness. Abruptly, a searing pain lanced through Lena's calf, and she cried out, her leg collapsing underneath her. A dog had lunged from the side, latching onto her lower leg. She could feel its teeth savaging her flesh, grinding against bone. Lena screamed, thrashing to dislodge the beast. Agony ripped through her as its fangs tore free, shredding skin and muscle. The rifle flew from her hands as she fell, clattering on the chunks of concrete. She scrabbled for the gun, fingernails scraping bloody on the rough debris. The dog pounced again, its fetid breath washing over her as it aimed for her throat. Lena flung up an arm in desperate defense. The dog's jaws clamped down on her forearm, and Lena howled, feeling the bones snap like dry kindling. White-hot torment blazed up her arm, drowning out all thought, obliterating the shouts and snarls and gunshots. This was it, some distant part of her realized. This was how she died, torn to pieces by scavenging mutts, just another bit of carrion in the wasteland. A meaningless, empty death. She'd failed them, failed all the precious lives depending on her. Suddenly the dog's weight vanished, its snarling cut off with a yelp. Lena blinked, struggling to focus through the red haze of pain. A pair of strong arms hauled her upright, practically carrying her. The ragged remains of the pack swirled around them, harried by gunshots and wild swings. "I've got you," a male voice bellowed over the chaos. "Just hold on." Lena didn't have the strength to reply, fighting to stay conscious as she was half dragged, half carried. Her mangled arm dangled uselessly, flaring with agony at each jerking step. The bite on her calf burned like acid. The snarls and yelps of the dogs fell away behind them, fading beneath the hammer of her pulse in her ears. Lena drifted, her head lolling, barely aware of her rescuer barking orders. A shelter door grinding open, hands grabbing her, easing her onto a gurney. Then there was only darkness. A cold, pitiless void that rose up to swallow her, dragging her down into its unfeeling depths. The pain dissolved, replaced by heavy oblivion. Lena let go, surrendering to the black, not even feeling the needle slide into her arm. The first of many. Her last coherent thought was a mute apology to the people she had failed, whose hopes died with her, torn away by tooth and claw. Lena clawed her way up from the depths of unconsciousness, battling through layers of thick, cloying darkness. Lena clawed her way up from the depths of unconsciousness, battling through layers of thick, cloying darkness. Her mind felt sluggish, mired in a fog of drugs and pain. Muffled voices swirled around her, distant and indistinct, like sounds underwater. She struggled to open her eyes, her lids leaden. The fluorescent light stabbed into her retinas, and she winced, squinting against the harsh glare. An antiseptic smell hung in the air, sharp and chemical, mingling with the coppery tang of blood. Hospital. The word floated up from the haze, incongruous. There were no more hospitals, some part of her remembered. Not after the bombs. So where? The shelter. Memory crashed over her like a frigid wave. The radiation. The desperate supply run. The feral dog pack. Fangs in her flesh, bones snapping, pain obliterating thought. Lena jerked, fully awake, her heart slamming against her ribs. She tried to sit up to orient herself, but her body wouldn't respond. Limbs laden, muscles watery and weak. Panic surged in her chest, coppery on her tongue. A strong hand found her shoulder, gently pressing her back down. "Easy, Doc. You're safe. You're back in the shelter. Just lie still." That voice. Even muffled by the drugs, she recognized it. The man who had saved her, pulled her from the jaws of the pack. Lena turned her head, blinking to focus. He swam into view, features resolving. Craggy and stubbled, dark hair shaved close to the scalp. Gray eyes met hers, kind but stern. "You gave us a real scare, Doc. Lost a lot of blood. Thought we might lose you." Lena swallowed hard, trying to work some moisture into her dry mouth. How long the words came out raspy, barely audible. 3 days. Been touch and go. Had to keep you under while the nanites did their work. He nodded to her arm. Lena glanced down, confused. Her mangled forearm was hidden under clean white bandages, but it felt whole. No screaming pain, no grating of shattered bone. An IV snaked it from the inside of her elbow, glinting with an odd silvery tint. "Nanites?" The man read the questions in her eyes. "New protocol we've been working on. Silver nanoparticles coated with stem cells and growth factors. Knits bone and tissue back together at an accelerated rate." He shook his head, something like awe in his expression. "Never seen anything like it. Your arm was hamburger, Doc. Now barely a scar. Evolution is a hell of a thing. Evolution." The word echoed in Lena's mind, calling up memory. The anomaly she had found, the impossible changes in their DNA. Was this some new expression of that? Some new power the fallout had birthed in him? She shook her head, overwhelmed, trying to process it all. The supply run. Did we get what we needed? The man's lips twitched toward a smile. Yeah, Doc, we got it. No small thanks to you. Drew those mongrels off us long enough to raid that mini-mart. He squeezed her shoulder. Paid a price for it, but we're flush with food and med supplies for now. All thanks to you. Lena let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. They had made it. Despite the cost, the horrific gamble, they had bought a little more time, given those precious lives a fighting chance. Tears stung her eyes, relief and pain and gratitude tangling in her chest. Thank you, she whispered hoarsely, for coming back for me. For pulling me out of there. She knew it wasn't what he wanted to hear, that he believed the mission mattered more than any one life. But she needed to say it, to let him know his courage, his selflessness, hadn't gone unseen. The man just shook his head, something sad etched in the lines of his face. As if it was him who was in her debt, not the reverse. But all he said was, "Get some rest, Doc. Got a lot of work still ahead of us." Lena nodded, feeling the drugs pull at her, dragging her back down. She didn't fight it this time, letting herself sink into the dark. There would be time enough for questions later, to understand what was happening to them on a molecular level. For now, it was enough that they'd survived, that their little shelter endured to fight another day. She had been right. That stubborn human spark, that ember, still burned. With that comforting thought, she let herself slip away. Let the healing darkness claim her once more. The next days passed in a blur of recovery and adjustment. Lena marveled at her body's resilience, the impossibly rapid mending of her wounds. What should have taken months of convalescence occurred in mere days. The bandages came off, revealing shiny pink skin where mangled meat had been. The muscles firmed and strengthened, dexterity returning to fingers that should have been crippled. It defied everything she knew as a doctor, defied science. And yet, the evidence was there, undeniable. In the progress of her own healing, in the updates from the genetics team poring over the new data, the radiation, the toxic fallout, it was changing them, hardening them, giving them abilities that bordered on the supernatural. Lena dove into the research, the mystery of it. Even as the essential work of survival continued, rationing, inventory, power management. That small human settlement, their fragile bubble of life in the poison wasteland, had to be maintained, tended to like a guttering flame. Scavenging parties went out again and again, braving the blasted hellscape for crucial supplies. Each time they came back harder, worrier, but also subtly changed. Skin thickened to a bark-like texture that could turn a blade. Senses heightened to an almost animal keenness. One man came back with eyes that glowed an eerie green in the dark. His pupils slit like a snake. Another grew vicious claws, curved and deadly sharp. A woman sprouted downy fur from her pores, iridescent in the light. Lena documented it all, marveling, even as she mourned the loss of their old, fragile humanity. These were adaptations, mutations on a scale and speed never before seen by science. Their bodies becoming survival machines, honed to a razor's edge. To what end, she couldn't say. What new species they might be becoming. But with each foray into the poisoned world above, they shed a little more of their past selves. Gained some new, fearsome advantage carved from the atomic hellscape. Lena watched it all, chronicling, trying to understand, to predict what they might yet become, and how to guide that change, shape that evolution into something that could truly endure, not just survive, but thrive in this brave new world. A world forever altered on a molecular level, where the very building blocks of life had been rewritten by the nuclear fire. The old rules, the old limits, all of that was gone, swept away like the cities and billions who had perished. Now it was up to them, this small shred of stubborn life, to define what came next, to master themselves and their strange new reality. She didn't know yet what shape that would take, what unimaginable forms they might embody. But Lena knew, deep in her gut, it was their only path forward, the only hope for something to rise from these atomic ashes, for life to find a way, however strange and twisted, to the other side of Armageddon. With grim resolve, she bent anew to her research, to the mission, to charting a course through this undiscovered country for the precious, mutated lives in her care. The weeks bled into months as their strange evolution continued. Each venture into the blasted wasteland brought new wonders and horrors, the toxic landscape sculpting them, molding them like clay. Some changes were subtle, a thickening of the skin, a sharpening of the senses, others more overt, even grotesque. Limbs twisted into new configurations, organs metastasized into novel structures. One woman's bones softened and deformed until she moved with a serpentine fluidity, coiling and striking with hideous speed. Lena cataloged it all with a scientist's detached eye, even as her heart wrenched. Even as she fought to find some shred of their lost humanity beneath the monstrous changes. It was there still, however, deeply buried, that stubborn, guttering spark, that refusal to give in to the dark. She saw it in their eyes as they gathered for the nightly rations, weary and shell-shocked but determined. As they comforted each other through the pain of the change, the loss of self, they still had each other, even if they could scarcely recognize themselves. That solidarity, that care for one another, it was perhaps the last truly human thing about them. The one part of the old world worth saving, worth carrying into the new. Lena clung to it, nurtured it, even as she herself began to change. It started small, nails hardening into claws, teeth elongating, sharpening. The itch as her skin thickened, tiny scales budding beneath the surface. Each change was terrifying, a fresh loss to grieve. But she bore them stoically, a model to the others. They looked to her for strength, for guidance through this uncharted territory. She couldn't afford to crumble, and miraculously their little shelter still endured. The nuclear winter slowly loosening its grip topside, temperatures rising degree by precious degree, hinting at a far-off spring. Around them the world lay in ruins, but in their haven, life continued, fragile and tenacious. Until the day their evolution turned from a slow march into a headlong sprint. One of the scavengers, out amid the rubble, was caught in a sudden electrical storm, a freakish burst of ball lightning. He was struck, knocked unconscious, and carried back by his team. They laid him out in the infirmary, scorched and barely breathing. Lena worked over him for hours, trying every treatment in her strange new medical arsenal, but he remained insensate, hovering on the knife's edge of death. Until, in a moment she would never forget, his body began to change, to warp and twist with horrifying speed, flesh flowing like liquid wax. Bones cracked and splintered, reforming into new, monstrous configurations. Muscles pulsed and writhed, growing at a grotesque rate. Lena stumbled back from the gurney, hand pressed to her mouth in shock as she watched the transformation. It was like a bomb had gone off in his DNA, shattering the limits of biology, evolving him from one breath to the next into something post-human, something out of a mad scientist's nightmare. In the space of minutes, the man was gone, and in his place a hulking, vaguely person-shaped mass of pulsing dark matter. Electricity crackled across the oily surface of his skin, arsing between new, scythe-like claws. A featureless ovoid sac of a head swiveled toward her, a glowing line splitting it in a jack-o'-lantern mockery of a mouth. For a moment, Lena was sure this would be her end, that this creature, birthed from the atomic hell above, would smash through their haven and destroy everything they'd fought to preserve. And in her darkest heart, part of her welcomed it, an end to the suffering, the ceaseless struggle. Let it all be over. But as she stared into that alien, glowing maw, she saw something familiar. A flash of terrified, agonized humanity in the electric depths. The man was still in there, somehow, aware, screaming for help. She stepped forward, palm extended in both supplication and comfort. "I see you," she said softly. "I see you in there. We will help you. You're still human. You're still one of us." The creature shuddered. The corona of energy dimmed. It lowered its claws, the deadly tips trembling as it fought for control. And slowly, haltingly, that glowing slash of a mouth moved. "Hurts. Hurts so much. Help ... me." The words were mangled, barely intelligible. But they were words. Language. The creature clutched its head, a keening wail building in its throat. "What ... am I?" Lena stepped closer, her fear forgotten in a rush of scientific awe and a deeper, fiercer compassion. "You're an evolution," she said gently, laying a hand on the slick hide of its arm. "A metamorphosis. The storm changed you, accelerated your adaptation to this new world." She met the anguished glow of its eyes. "But you're still you, still human. Where it counts, we'll figure this out together. Learn to control your change, your abilities." The creature shuddered, the glow intensifying as it struggled to absorb her words. Lena gripped its arm tighter. "You're not alone in this. I'm changing too. We all are. But we're still human, still a community. That hasn't changed." She squeezed, meeting that luminous gaze with all the conviction in her soul. "You're still one of us, and we take care of our own." Slowly, the creature lowered its claws. The energy dimmed to a faint crackle. It bowed its head, a gesture of trust, of submission. Lena let out a breath, her heart thundering. She knew nothing would be the same now. There was no going back from this. The game had changed irrevocably. But there was also, for the first time in months, a thrill of something like hope. They weren't just scrabbling to survive now, eking out a meager existence. They were becoming something new, something powerful, something that might have a chance of reclaiming this world. She squeezed the creature's arm once more. A promise. Then turned to the gathered crowd of changed and changing survivors. A strange new species huddled in the atomic dark. Her people. Her people. Her promise to all of them. "All right, everyone. Let's get to work. We have a lot to learn. A lot to rebuild." She took a deep breath, letting it out slow. "It's a new world out there. A world we need to understand, to master, so we can make it ours again." She met the eyes of each of her people, seeing the mingled fear and determination. The stubborn, unquenchable humanity. "It won't be easy, but I believe we can do this. I believe we can become what we need to be, to take back our home." A ripple passed through the crowd, a shifting of stance, a hardening of resolve. She saw it catch like a spark, flaring to life in their changed and changing eyes. A single nod, a fist raised in solidarity. They were with her. Dying. Lena turned to the creature, her strange new patient and kin. "We will figure this out," she promised again. "Together. You're not alone." It inclined its head, the glow briefly intensifying in acknowledgement. In gratitude. Lena straightened her shoulders, facing down this terrifying new reality with the indomitable will that had brought her this far. That had brought all of them this far. They were changed, warped, mutated almost beyond recognition, but still, at their core, human. That unquenchable spark, that stubborn will to survive and thrive, still burned. Lena stoked that spark, nurtured it in herself and each of her crew. They would need it in the days to come. The world had changed in a baptism of atomic fire, had spat out the old and demanded something new, something fierce and monstrous and unbreakable. Lena would become that thing. They all would together. The inheritors of this blasted earth. The seeds of a strange new genesis blooming in the fallout. The future belonged to them now. She set to work, filled with a grim and unflagging purpose, ready to lead them into the brutal new dawn.